So our final guest is Marc Brightside, who's read from his first collection, Beacon Family, again, former Winchester student, who came placed in the top 10 of the National Poetry Competition, right?
Yes, that is honestly the only reason anyone knows who I am right now. Beforehand, I think I'd maybe published 6 or 7 poems, possibly. So beforehand, I was very much an unknown entity, and this competition gave me a brief moment of attention, which, as a writer, I crave. So that was good. That was good. Thank you very much. So I wasn't actually planning to read this one first, but now that you've mentioned the National Poetry Competition, I feel the need to indulge. So when I left Winchester in 2016, I very deliberately set out to myself and I said, I'm going to write a collection and I'm going to put this all together, and I want it to be largely new material. So most of this was written purposefully for the sake of this book. There are a couple of adaptations of older pieces, but most of this is new. And as a result of this, when I left Winchester, I started going to charity shops and bookstores and just anywhere I could find, really, and just picking up poetry books, picking up new poetry from authors who I didn't recognize, people who I didn't know, people I didn't have to read, just so I understood what was being done at the moment in the world of modern poetry. And one of the things that stuck out to me when I was reading all these different books was how cynical some of them are. And all the emotional manipulation, the lying, the self-aggrandizement, all of these different things coming across in these poetry collections. And one of the things that really upset me, actually, when I was reading these, was this idea that somehow a poem being sad gives it an inherent value, this idea that misery equals artistic merit somehow. So on that front, I feel quite guilty that this next poem placed in the National Poetry Competition, because it is a sad poem, as many are. It's a poem about my first memory, the earliest thing that I can remember from a child. This is 11 Years of May. A feed of it A pertains a gherkin. I was cross-legged on the floor, bordering on 5 years old, when death was just a thing that grown-ups did, like holidays or weddings. We ate dinner in Sudoku silence, savouring the council house delight of fish and chips wrapped in the metro, and my father's entree, his pungent batter sticks, appeared to captivate me. You always want what you can't have, he said. You won't appreciate it. I whined until he caved, and the ascetic fire sent me rolling to the floor, scratching at my tongue while everybody laughed. No one could blame them. At dawn, Mother smiled from the door as I split branches with my brother in the garden. 20 years between us, and we still pretended these were swords, that we were gladiators. A feed of it B pertains to suicide. I was cross-legged on the floor, bordering on 6 years old, with plastic bricks and model trains to normalize my isolation, the way you let a new fish float for 15 minutes prior to release. Knock. My mother rose, crossword left unfinished, and spoke quietly with men in lime green jackets. The house turned sepia that day. My recollection is in Kodachrome. Your brother always loved you, she said. He loved all of us, always, but not himself, because he did drugs. Colin, named so because the midwife asked what they were calling him. That's my mother's sense of humor. A feed of it C pertains a haunting. The lights came at the foot of summer's door. They'd manifest in droves, patchy frames of green and yellow, irregularly red, phantom jigsaw pieces blinking on and off. They outran me in the hallway, slipped away when I tore through the living room with airplane arms, emptying my lungs. Look out, it's Colin's ghost, as mother wept into her hands. Ghosts exist when you're a child. They mean that no one has to leave if you don't want them to. I knew Colin was dying when the lights became ephemeral. For a time, I could still summon them. With only a moment's breakdown, they would swarm like butterflies on bitter honey, because a child's pain is easier to digest and a single tear is far more tragic than a torrent. I knew that he was dead when the lights had bled me dry, when they refused to answer to an empty howl when I was 17. So yeah, this book was a bit of an experience for me. I'd never properly sat down and said to myself, I'm going to produce a large volume of poetry over a period of time. And possibly because I learned poetry at university, I do work better to deadlines. So I started the day after I handed in my master's dissertation, and I more or less worked constantly from there. And anyone who is writing a manuscript at the moment, just remember that when it's finished, you will go back and edit it. You can say to yourself you want, but you absolutely will, and you won't be able to resist it either. And then someone will accept one of your poems and you'll have to debate with them which version to include. But anyway, so this next one is one that I'm quite fond of. If I can actually remember where it is. There we go. This was one of the first poems that I produced for the collection, so probably back in late January, possibly. I'm not 100% sure. This is Influence A. Chinese takeaways provide an endless source of free newspapers. Mum encouraged me to read at every turn. Her logic being that I couldn't know my worldview without first viewing the world, and print takes just a bit more thought than colours pumped into your eyeballs, filling in your grey. I like to play a game with those I trust, wherein we read the first 5 pages to each other, deadpan, and listen for inflections that portray genders we would otherwise prefer not to display. The front page is a toddler's day trip in his sister's dress, how brave he is, how we should love him. The second is a doctor whose potential cure for Werdnick Hoffman's could become reality by 2022. The third is for an actress, down on her luck, showing some cleavage. A veteran's descent into dementia spirals down the no man's land of middle pages, lost in folds, but some guy who found a hair in his bread roll can get a paragraph under the bombings in Paris. Findings thus far seem to indicate The Guardian is bollocks, and the Daily Mail is a borderline carcinogen, but this is why we play the game, to see things from a light beyond our own. A past acquaintance claimed he had no bias. He saw only a sequence of events, apparently. This exercise was wasted on him. Only fools are shackled to mundane priorities, he said. It's worth mentioning that he liked Ayn Rand, and my acquaintance was honestly an idiot. So this book is semi-autobiographical, and I say semi, that there are embellishments here and there, and I will very openly admit that. I mentioned before that one of the main themes that interest me here is cynicism and manipulation and lying, and the effects that lying have on us, but both as people and as artists, because that's what a writer is, essentially, is you are a professional embellisher. The goal is, at the end of the day, to entertain. And as such, you can pick up any book off the shelf and you can count the tearjerker poems and you can imagine the author crying into their bathroom mirror while they write it. That's what I wanted to avoid. I didn't want this to feel like a self-congratulatory exercise. But there are autobiographical elements in here, and I would be doing a disservice if I didn't admit that. So this next poem is one of several about my father, who I had a very difficult relationship with. I hope that comes across as I read these next few poems. This first one is called Dirty Blood. Our family's facade was an endeavour, smiling for the neighbours at their Christmas parties, teeth scraping the surface in old photographs. My mother showed me how to keep secrets, and my father, the London wide boy from South Yorkshire, taught me how to lie. It was years before I could pronounce his Polish surname, or knew the record of my father's alias, that mark of disassociation tattooed on his forearm. A real shame. Chris loves Chris was such a funny joke, while its origins were still clandestine. I suppose it had to happen. To realise is a phenomenon predicated on erasure, the death of old realities to welcome newer truths in all their lustre, and the same way that a parent learns which truths are suitable for tiny ears, children learn what questions not to ask. So when you first become aware of Daddy's blood-borne illness, his prescription diet based on bullet pills and protein drinks, you won't debate the matter, not forever. Daddy takes his medication twice a day, and everyone's okay. No need to worry. I make a point of getting tested every year. Doctors tell me that the odds of intravenous poisoning are non-existent. Then I think of when he held me as a baby, his lizard skin cracked and cobblestoned, so many avenues to let his dirty blood invade. That piece of paper helps me sleep at night, the evidence confirming I am not like him, I am not his clone, I do not have AIDS. So just to break up the family poems a little bit, because I don't want to feel like I'm just throwing them all out there all at once. As part of going out there and experiencing new poetry after I left Winchester, I went to a lot of book launches. I just looked on the Poetry Society website, looked at what was available, what was happening, and just sort of got myself out there and started meeting people. And one of them was for an author who I quite respect, not necessarily so much the publisher. And the event itself did bother me, actually, for reasons that you'll hear in a second. It was a very formal affair, very well conducted and everything, but it was the atmosphere there was very unencouraging. So, without naming any names, of course, this next poem is about reverence. Writers sit like woodpeckers in coffee shops, all sudden looks and twitchy feet. You're either 25 or want to be at these events, where name drops fall like cigarettes, and every guest has pictures of their famous friends, studied philosophy at famous school in place exotic. Are you a poet too? No, I'm here because I missed my shot of self-aggrandizement this week and felt like catching up. They watch in reverence, waiting for a bow, eyes awake for weakness in the publisher's defense, and I think, secretly, they all hate poetry. They've been dreaming about dreaming of this. Don't be that person when you go to a book launch. Publishers won't like you for it. So while I was living in Winchester, I was actually engaged for a time to someone who I only occasionally loved. It was one of those very life-changing decisions, I think, where you realize that you don't necessarily have to settle for averageness and settle for someone who, well, as we'll see in this poem, wasn't necessarily the ideal choice for a long-term prospect. This was inspired by the moment where that relationship became not necessarily toxic, but where it became aware of that relationship's temporary status, I suppose. It was a trip to the Winchester Water Meadows, which if you haven't gone there before, I think every writer should at least once. It's a beautiful, beautiful area down there. But yeah, so this is inspired by that trip. This is Meadow Song. We took a day away from city life to drown ourselves in protest. A winding trail by the old mill gave us shelter down a Hampshire mile, where the countryside hummed cricket songs and damsels coupled in mid-flight at waterside, intoxicated by the summer's hiding place, a church for godless folk and tweedy painters. This picture goes out to the westward guest, a trendy little thing, first to say, I love you, and expect the phrase to be returned. I blink, and she's still here. We're standing at the altar, covering our ears, disregarding our abrasions in the hopes they won't turn septic, deliberating over what to name our dogs. I blink twice, and she is gone. My fingers tingle between 2 and 4, thin survivors severed from the burden of a handheld promise in a broken glass ring that looks the same today, a trophy from the war we watched on television, slumped across the sofa, padding out our runtime. I look back and think, we could have shared a life together. I take stock, and I remember that we could have died alone. So this next poem was a bit of a consistent issue, going back to the family topic that I mentioned before. My parents' divorce, which was very much long overdue at that time, occurred while I was living here and while I was studying here, and it took place over the course of about 2.5 years, which, being 70 miles away from home, was quite difficult to experience because you are essentially powerless in that situation. There's nothing you can do, there's nothing you can get involved in, and you have to listen to the stories on the infrequent visits from between Croydon, where I grew up, and Winchester. So if I can actually find the poem, that would be very helpful. You can tell I didn't prepare for this, I do apologise. Here we go. So this next poem is called Hold the Line, and it's dedicated to my mother, who, in spite of everything, is an incredibly brave woman. As I drop the page again. Hold the line. We all see the signs. She huddles in increasing layers, cardigans to hide a healthy shine, summer sleeves to mask the marks across her collarbone, her wrists. The walls aren't quite as thick as they once were. Rest assured, my father never hit me growing up. He only hits the ones who can't hit back. Mother calls to say our dog is at the vet's today. tending to a broken leg. She says he twisted it while he was running. We arrange a meeting for next Sunday morning and she holds the line. I offer to come home instead. She says there is no need. It's 2012. She's showing more. Her pride is tangible as she recounts her routine of antagonizing him the night that she compared my father to his own, the silly face he made when he went through the ceiling. I refrain from asking if she'll count the bruises this time. Harry Chapin comes to visit, and I fold over the desk. I often wonder how it starts, why hands turn into fists, who else knows but keeps their anger confidential, how much I would sacrifice to poison him because I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. So I think following on from that one, the best thing to do would be to dedicate a poem to my dog, actually, who's still with us now. He's 12 years old, he's a Collie Cross Lab, and I think during my parents' divorce was the one thing that kept, at the very least, my mother alive during that process. So this one's called For the Member Who Can't Read. Mother found you at the kennels, returned 3 times and scheduled for execution. Your name was Freddie, number 2. We thought Ben would suit you better. Later, you turned into Ben Dog, the collie Labrador with cotton socks, protector of the small and weak, a black and white brick shithouse on 4 sumpy legs. My mother would have died without you. You brought happiness into a joyless family, made my months in solitary seem benign, brought credence to the theory that you popped into reality to save us. You're fading now, greying in the chops, and I cannot apologize enough for what you had to see. You cannot read this, but I hope you like your name, and I promise I will wait with you when you are leaving. Got time for one more? So to end off on a nice note, when I was living in Winchester, I kept, I suppose, what you'd call like a memory box, not necessarily a diary, just a thing where I could put photographs and train tickets and mementos that were in some way important to my time here. So it was a very changing experience for me. I was here for 5.5 years. And yeah, this box grew and grew and grew to the point where I had almost a bag's worth to take home with me when I eventually moved away. So this poem is about looking back on that in hindsight and thinking, you know, fuck, it's 5 years. That's a large percentage of my life at this point. So this poem is called Leftovers. Underneath the bed frame rests a shoebox full of throwaway tat, crap prescribed a value based on who delivered it, if it's sustainable or fossil fuel, if the crap giver is absent or deceased, if I care either way. I use a shoebox because shoes are meant for traveling, and in my head this sounded like a good reason until I wrote it down. That one love letter lives in there, diluted by thesaurus syndrome and some awkward turns of phrase, but A for effort. Let's be generous for days gone by. When we tanked, when I was no longer the most amazing man in the world, it went in the shoebox. Underneath the ornaments, newspaper clippings, and a dozen foreign coins. My second letter landed on its feet, beautiful and raw, and straight into the box. Provisions for the day, my name, or hers, can be replaced. I keep them all together. In time, they might eventually fuse and form a statue or memorial. A piece of my maternal granddad lines the floor. He used to call me wee man late into my teens, and by the time he died, he wanted nothing more than to be scattered by the wife he couldn't love. His name was Frank. Towards the end, his hands had vertigo, so the leftovers looked more like Frank. Thank you.